morning mist hung low over Lake Serenity, the kind that blurs the line between sky and water. From my back porch, the world looked suspended in silence, blue-gray air, the faint ripple of light across still water, and the soft creak of my old dock swaying with the current. For a long time, that view had been my salvation. After Claire passed, I bought this place to disappear from noise. I wanted stillness, something that didn't demand conversation or pretense. I found it here, at the far end of this gated lake community, where the water met the pines and the HOA promised tranquil, living and neighborly harmony. That was before I met Karen Whitmore. Karen was the kind of woman who made neighborhood harmony sound like a military order. Blonde hair too perfect for someone her age, teeth so white they looked hostile in sunlight, and a tone that could turn a compliment into a reprimand. She ran the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association like it was a Fortune 500 company. Weekly meetings, enforcement notices, and public humiliation for anyone who forgot to mow within regulation height. And her son, Chase Whitmore, had just moved into the house next door. Chase was in his late 20s, worked remotely, or so he claimed, and spent most afternoons shirtless blasting music from his boat. He was everything Karen wanted the world to admire, and everything I didn't want to deal with. But it started small. A friendly wave across the lawn. A few "hey man" greetings from Chase when he borrowed my ladder, my rake, even my power washer. Then one afternoon, I noticed fresh paint markers along the edge of my lakefront. Thin orange stakes planted deep into the soil, right where my dock extended. At first, I assumed they were part of some community maintenance. Then I saw Karen's SUV idling by the curb, her clipboard balanced on the steering wheel. I walked over. "Morning, Karen, what's all this?" She smiled, the kind of smile that arrives just before bad news. "Ethan, good. I was hoping to catch you. We're expanding the community access area. Just a few feet to make room for shared lake use." You understand, my stomach tightened. "This is my property line. The deed shows my boundary runs to the dock." Karen tilted her head. "Well, technically, the shoreline easement overlaps community space. It's complicated. You'll thank me later, I promise." Then she drove off before I could reply. By the weekend, Chase had a brand new kayak rack installed, on my side of the stakes. I spent that Saturday pacing the line, tape measure in hand, checking survey coordinates for my old closing documents. The numbers didn't lie. My lakefront was being carved up and no one had asked my permission. When I brought it up at the next HOA meeting, Karen acted surprised. "Oh, Ethan," she said sweetly, "this was discussed in last month's meeting." "I wasn't notified," I said. "You were copied in the minutes. I never received them." "Well," she said, closing her binder with a loud snap, "we voted unanimously. It's official," the room murmured. Most of the neighbors looked away, eyes fixed on the coffee urn or the snack table. No one wanted to challenge Karen. She had a way of making resistance feel like social suicide. That night I sat by the water until the moon rose over the trees. The air smelled like pine and wet soil, and for the first time since Claire's death I felt something close to rage. Not wild anger, no, this was quieter, sharper, like the slow turn of a knife. I started thinking about lines, how every human relationship depends on them. Boundaries, limits, ownership. You cross one without permission and everything changes. By the next morning I'd made a decision. Over the following week I became obsessed. I reread every line of my property deed, every HOA bylaw, every zoning ordinance. I called the county recorder's office, requested boundary maps, and spent evenings pacing with a flashlight and measuring tape. And every day, Karen's smile grew wider. One afternoon, I caught her standing near the stakes again, chatting with Chase. She turned when she saw me, holding a glass of iced tea like she was in some southern plantation fantasy. "Ethan," she said, "we're so glad you're being cooperative. Chase will be installing a small dock extension. Nothing permanent. On my property?" I asked. "Well, it's community property now." The board agreed. I looked at Chase, who smirked. "Don't worry, old man. I'll keep it clean." Karen's voice hardened. "You know, Ethan, if you have concerns, you're always welcome to file a complaint, but I'd really hate for things to become unpleasant." She turned and walked away, the air perfumed with her victory. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my workshop with an old drafting lamp, tracing lines on the blueprint of my property. The faint hum of insects filled the dark. I drew a thick black stroke right through the disputed section, bisecting the lakefront like a scar. When I stepped outside, the moon reflected off the water in cold silver streaks. The stakes stood there like trespassers. I stared at them until I could almost hear Claire's voice again, soft and tired. "Don't let people take what you love, Ethan." By dawn, I'd made my decision. I called a supplier I used to work with in Denver. Stone, mortar, gravel. I told them I'd be needing a delivery. When they asked for the project type, I said, boundary restoration. That afternoon, a flatbed truck pulled up. Karen watched from her porch, phone in hand. Chase came out shirtless again, laughing. "Building something, neighbor?" he called. "Yeah," I said, wiping the dust from my hands. "Just putting things back where they belong." Karen's smile faltered for the first time. As the sun set that evening, I set the first stone into the soil, right down the middle of the so-called community access. It was heavy, unyielding, permanent. Each stone echoed with the memory of what had been taken, what I refused to lose again. When the crickets began their chorus and the lake turned black under the stars, I leaned on my shovel and looked at the growing line between my property and theirs. A boundary. A promise. I whispered to the night, "You'll thank me later." Then I smiled because I finally understood what she meant. That night I drew a line she'd never cross again. The sound of stone against stone has a rhythm. When you're alone long enough, you start to hear it like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, unrelenting. That's what filled my mornings for the next 2 weeks. By the time the first frost touched the lake, the foundation of my wall stretched 30 feet across the disputed line, waist high, built from rough-cut fieldstone, each piece chosen like a word in a long, angry letter. To anyone else, it was just a wall. To me, it was a statement. This far, no farther. Of course, it didn't take long for the HOA to notice. The first notice appeared taped to my front door, printed in the HOA's signature blue and gold letterhead. Notice of violation. Unauthorized construction within communal space. Cease all building activity immediately or face fines and removal of unapproved structure. Signed, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. I laughed out loud when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Karen always believed paperwork was stronger than principle. When I didn't respond, she showed up in person. It was a Saturday morning, cold and crisp, the kind of air that smells like smoke and pine needles. I was mixing mortar when I heard her heels crunch across the gravel. "Ethan," she called, voice sharp and syrupy. "Can we talk for a moment?" I didn't look up. "You're already talking. I'm serious, so am I." She sighed in a sound practiced over decades of getting her way. "You can't just build a wall across community land. It violates HOA guidelines." "This isn't community land," I said evenly. "It's mine. According to the board." "The board isn't the county assessor," I interrupted. Her smile cracked just a little. "You're making this personal." "It is personal." I laid another stone. "You stole my lakefront." Karen folded her arms. "We adjusted it for community benefit. Your son's boat isn't a community." Her lips pressed into a tight line. "You're going to regret this." "I already regret not doing it sooner." She stared at me for a long moment, eyes glinting cold behind her sunglasses. Then she turned and walked away. Chase watched from their deck, laughing quietly as she muttered into her phone. By that evening, I'd received another notice, and the next morning, a third fines, threats, citations. I stacked each one neatly in a folder labeled Proof. That week, the neighborhood began to shift. People who once waved now pretended not to see me. The HOA newsletter described ongoing disputes threatening the harmony of our lakeside community. My name wasn't printed, but everyone knew. A few neighbors tried to stay neutral. Half-hearted smiles, nervous conversations by the mailboxes, but most sided with Karen. Power is magnetic. And in Lake Serenity, Karen Whitmore was the North Pole. I found myself eating alone on the porch every night, watching the sunset bleed into the lake behind my wall. I thought about Claire again, how she used to describe peace as owning your silence. For the first time, I understood what she meant. One evening, while setting stones under the orange dusk, I noticed Chase on his dock. He was drinking beer, playing music, trying to get under my skin. "Nice wall, neighbor," he shouted. "You planning to keep people out or yourself in?" I didn't answer. Seriously, man, he laughed, tossing his empty can into the water. You're wasting your time. Mom'll have it gone next week. Something inside me, something that had been quiet for too long, started to stir. I set the last stone of the day and turned toward him. Maybe, but at least when it's gone, there'll be proof I tried. He frowned, not understanding. Then he shrugged and walked inside. The next week brought the HOA meeting, and I was ready. The community center was full that night. Folding chairs lined in rows, the smell of coffee and perfume mixing with tension. Karen sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her loyal board members. Chase lounged in the back like a smug spectator. When she called the meeting to order, her voice carried the confidence of a politician. First on tonight's agenda, she said, unauthorized construction by homeowner Mr. Ethan Caldwell. She gestured toward me like a prosecutor presenting a criminal. Despite repeated notices, Mr. Caldwell has continued to build an illegal structure, infringing upon communal property. The board recommends fines totaling. Save it, I said, standing. Before you vote on anything, you should see this. I placed a thick envelope on the table. Inside, certified property surveys, satellite images, and correspondence from the county recorder's office. Karen's smile wavered. These, I said, are the original boundary maps from 1998, when Lake Serenity was established. They show my property line extending 15 feet beyond the point you marked as community access. The so-called shared zone never existed until you redrew the HOA maps last year. A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, "He's got proof?" Karen regained her composure. "Those are outdated. The community updated its zoning last year. Without county approval?" I said. "Because that's a felony, Karen." Her cheeks flushed. "You're being dramatic." I took a step forward, calm but deliberate. "You falsified documents so your son could have a boat slip. That's not community improvement. That's corruption." For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, electric. Finally, Karen said, "The board will review this privately," which meant she still wins. I nodded slowly. "Of course you will." I gathered my papers and walked out. That night I finished the wall. The rain came hard, soaking the soil, turning the stones slick beneath my gloves. Lightning flashed over the lake, illuminating the water in jagged bursts of silver. I worked until my hands bled, until the last stone fit into place. When I stepped back, the wall stretched solid and proud, not tall enough to block the view, but enough to make a statement. Thunder rolled across the lake. I stood there drenched, looking out at the dark water. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Not victory, not relief, just peace. Karen could find me, threaten me, slander me, but she couldn't erase what I'd built, because this wall wasn't just stone, it was proof. It was defiance. It was the line that finally gave me back what she'd taken. The next morning, I found Karen standing by the edge of the wall, umbrella in hand. The rain had stopped, but she hadn't left. When I stepped outside, she didn't speak. She just looked at me, tired, angry, defeated, as if she'd realized finally that I wasn't moving. I met her gaze. "It's done," I said quietly. "This isn't over," she murmured. "It is for me." She turned and walked away, her reflection trembling in the wet stone. I watched her disappear through the mist, the lake whispering against the shore. Behind me, the wall stood firm, slick with rain, shining faintly in the pale dawn light. "Now it's mine again," I whispered. And for the first time since Claire's death, I smiled, and not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped losing. By winter, the wall had become part of the landscape. Frost gathered along its edges in thin white veins, and snow settled into the cracks like old memories. To some, it looked like defiance. To me, it looked like peace. Rough, imperfect, but mine. Yet peace doesn't last long in a place ruled by people like Karen Whitmore. The HOA doubled my fines. They filed complaints with the county zoning board, alleging unapproved modifications to shared land. I started getting letters from attorneys whose names I didn't recognize, all with polite threats about removal by legal means. I stopped answering the door. Neighbors avoided me now. Even the kids who used to fish near my dock stayed away, told by their parents that Mr. Caldwell's angry. The silence that once felt like solace had turned into exile. Every night, I'd sit by the fireplace with the file folder of documents spread across the coffee table, survey maps, receipts, email threads, proof that I wasn't the villain they wanted me to be. And still I waited, because I knew Karen, and I knew she wasn't done. She struck back in February. It was early morning when I heard the sound of an engine near the water. Deep, mechanical, deliberate. I pulled back the curtain and froze. A small backhoe sat near the shoreline. Chase stood beside it, hood up against the cold, talking to the operator. The machine's bucket was already scraping at the edge of the wall. I was outside before they could make the second pass. "Turn it off," I shouted, voice echoing across the lake. Chase looked over, startled. "Relax, old man. HOA ordered the removal." I stepped between him and the machine. "You touch this wall again and I'll have you arrested." "Arrested?" He laughed. "It's not even your property anymore. Try me." For a moment he hesitated. Then Karen appeared, her coat buttoned tight, clipboard in hand as if she'd just stepped out of a courtroom. "Ethan," she said coolly, "you were warned. You've left us no choice." I could feel the anger rising, the cold air burning in my lungs. "You think you can erase this because you wrote it on paper?" She gave a short, brittle laugh. "Because I run this community." "No," I said quietly. "You ruin it." The machine roared back to life. Something in me snapped. I stepped forward and slammed my hand onto the control panel, cutting the ignition. The operator swore and stumbled back. "Touch it again," I said, "and I'll call the county sheriff." Karen's voice trembled with rage. "This is destruction of HOA property." "This wall is built on my land," I said, "and I have the proof." She hesitated, just long enough for doubt to flicker across her face. Then she turned away. "Fine. You'll hear from our lawyers." They left. The machine, the clipboard, the arrogance, all of it rolled back up the hill and out of sight. When the silence returned, I sat down on the cold stone of my wall. The sun was just breaking, over the trees casting a weak golden light over the frozen water. My hands were shaking, not from cold, from something heavier. I'd had enough. That night I went through every folder, every file, every line of evidence I'd collected since this started. Then I picked up the phone and called the one number Karen had always prayed I wouldn't. The County Land Use Commission. It took weeks of meetings, emails, and official visits. Inspectors with clipboards came out to the lake, surveying the shoreline, measuring distances, verifying coordinates. Karen tried to charm them, of course. Homemade cookies, practiced smiles. But I saw the fear in her eyes when the chief inspector asked for original HOA boundary approvals. By March, the investigation had spread beyond the HOA. The county discovered discrepancies, missing permits, forged signatures, altered digital maps, and all of it led back to Karen Whitmore. The showdown came one Saturday morning in early spring. The community center was packed again, just like before. Only this time the county officials sat in the front row. Karen looked paler than usual, her makeup heavier, her composure thin as glass. Chase sat behind her, stone-faced. The head, Inspector, a woman named Linda Perez, stood and cleared her throat. After reviewing all documentation, she said, "We've determined that the Lake Serenity HOA unlawfully redrew property boundaries without county authorization. This includes portions of Mr. Ethan Caldwell's lakefront. Furthermore, financial records indicate HOA funds were used for private construction on the Whitmore property." Gasps filled the room. Karen's face went crimson. "That's absurd. Those were community improvements." Linda cut her off. "Ma'am, the county disagrees. You'll be required to restore the original boundaries immediately and reimburse affected homeowners. The HOA's charter is now suspended pending legal review." The room erupted in whispers. Karen turned toward me, eyes blazing. "You did this." "No," I said quietly. "You did." She stood there, trembling, caught between fury and disbelief, a woman who'd ruled through fear now realizing fear had left the room. Chase tried to speak, but his words came out hollow. We were just trying to help the community. I looked at him, and for the first time, I almost felt sorry. Then maybe next time, start by not stealing from your neighbors. By summer, the HOA was gone. The fines, the rules, the petty control, dissolved. Karen sold her house within weeks. Chase's dock came down before the sale closed. Their windows went dark, and for the first time in years, the lake felt quiet again. The day the moving trucks left, I walked down to the water. The air was warm, the lake still. Sunlight spilled over the stones of my wall, now streaked with moss and memory. I traced my fingers across the rough surface, feeling the cool strength of it. It no longer looked like defiance. It looked like survival. That night I sat on the dock with a beer in hand, the lake whispering softly against the shore. The wall divided nothing now. No neighbors, no conflict, just peace. I thought of Claire again, her laughter in the wind, the way she'd said, "You find out who you are when you draw the line." I'd drawn mine, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in truth. And sometimes truth needs to be built in stone. As the sun dipped below the pines, I raised my bottle to the wall and smiled. "Here's to boundaries," I said quietly, "and to keeping what's yours." The lake shimmered in reply, gold and endless, and for the first time since moving to Lake Serenity I felt home.